Good evening and welcome to the Agile Coaching Exchange for April 2021. And we were just looking, I think this is our 14th remote meetup. So we're really pleased we've got that far. Fantastic. I first became aware of tonight's speaker by getting more involved in the Scrum Alliance, where she served as the Chief Scrum Master for the organization. As well as improving the Agile community at large, part of Melissa's role was engaging with the guides, the certified coaches and trainers, of which me and Helen are part of that group. Helping those people get together and bring them closer to the organization. And I just want to say, I have absolute huge respect for the way in which she worked tirelessly to bring the community together, building values based on empathy, compassion, and a shared understanding. And I'm sure for many of you that have ever worked in a specialist interest group, it can be very difficult sometimes to bring people on the same page when there's all these different diverse ideas and thoughts and feelings about what we should be. So absolutely total respect to Melissa for that. It was amazing. Today, as an enterprise coach who has an MBA, she's the VP for Business Agility at Source Labs, and we are absolutely, really mega pleased to link up with her tonight. Live from Denver, Colorado, where I believe it's late morning. Please give a very warm ACE welcome to our guest, Melissa Boggs.
Hello, everyone. It is late morning. I was sharing with Helen and Ben how many times I checked the time zone to make sure I actually showed up on time for you today because I was nervous. But as difficult as the pandemic has been, it has been really cool to be able to, join groups like this that typically I wouldn't on a random Wednesday be able to just, jump into and meet people. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, Ben, for the lovely introduction and Helen for having me. Let me begin by sharing my screen. While I do this, I just want to give you a heads up that this is an interactive talk. And if you're looking for a dish on Scrum Alliance, you're not going to get it here. Are you seeing the correct screen then? Okay. But I do want to share a bit about my experience because it was quite a journey, I'll say that, going from being a coach to actually running an organization at the CEO level. And it really changed my perspective on a lot of things, to be honest with you. So that's one of the things that I want to share, but also tap into your experience and have you share that with others as well. So the first thing I want to say is, I doubt you don't have Post-it notes, but if you do not have Post-its and Sharpies near you, or at least a piece of paper where you can write down a few things, I'm going to take 10 seconds and let you look around and grab that because you're going to need it throughout the presentation. Cool. Other thing I want to share with you is there are going to be a couple of breakouts. There's going to be some things I ask you to write down, and then you're going to go into a breakout with 2 or 3 other people. Whatever you write down, you don't necessarily have to share, but there will be parts of your story that I would love for you to share so that you can connect with the other people in your group. So there's safety in your notes, but also be prepared that you will share, whatever you're comfortable sharing with the people in your breakout room. All right, so with that, so I want you to first think back to your most challenging client. And it might be someone that you're working with right now. It might be someone that, was a couple years ago. But who is the most challenging executive level, if possible, client that you have worked with? Write their name down on a Post-it or a piece of paper. And I'll add, they'll never know that you wrote them down, so it's safe. I'm having you write it down on purpose because I want to humanize that person. I want to tell you a story in which I was that client. And I'm hoping in doing so that you're looking at their name and you're hearing my story and thinking about what they may have been experiencing at the same time. So Normally, at this point, I have to like tell a whole bunch about Scrum Alliance. Can I get a quick show of hands? How many of you are familiar with Scrum Alliance just as an organization? Awesome. Okay, cool. Yay. Save us a few minutes of not telling that whole story. So in the last 2 years, Scrum Alliance underwent a massive Agile transformation. That may sound surprising, just simply because it was Scrum Alliance. But when I arrived in January of 2019, Scrum Alliance was not necessarily Agile. It surprises a lot of people to hear that many teams weren't even familiar with Scrum. There were a couple of teams that were using pieces of it. And when I say we're not familiar with Scrum, they were certainly familiar with telling other people about it, but they hadn't experienced it themselves. And so one of the very first things I did when I got there was really evaluate, you know, like most coaches would when you got to a client, what it is that we needed. And I don't always recommend this for everyone, but for us, we needed a complete overhaul. Like we needed a big bang. And that's, you know, I'm usually a proponent of evolutionary change, but this was a time when revolution was needed. So back to the story. We were in the middle of a 3-day self-selection workshop. And by that, I mean, we were about halfway through looking at the work as an entire organization of 55 people or so, dividing the work into new persona teams, and the people in the organization deciding what team they wanted to be on. So we were very much leaning into where is your passion, where are your skills, you get to choose what team you're on. And it was far more stressful than I expected. Not just, you know, who's going to be where, but there, as you can imagine, there was a lot of anxiety and fear in the employees. What if I pick the wrong team? Why don't you just tell me what team I should be on? And frankly, naively, I was like, come on, this is like the gift everyone wants. You get to choose. But there's a lot of fear in that. And so about halfway through the workshop, you know, we're taking a lunch break and I'm sitting in my office, literally with my head in my hands, like this young lady in the picture here. And I'm surrounded by 3 of what I would consider the best coaches in the Scrum Alliance and even just in the Agile coaching community. I mean, literally 3 of the best coaches. And, you know, they were helping me facilitate the workshop and they were helping me move through this overall transformation. And in that moment, even if these weren't the words that they were using, what I was hearing was, it's okay, just do this. It's okay, just do this. It's okay, you know, you've got this, just ... And I sat there for a moment, and at one point I looked up at the 3 of them and I said, I completely understand where you're coming from and I love all of you guys, but this is a lot harder for me than it is for you. And it was a watershed moment for me, not just as the leader in that moment, but as a coach, because I realized almost like a bolt of lightning, how many times I had been in the coach position. And even if I didn't say it out loud, in my head, I was thinking, oh, come on, you know what you need to do, just do it. Just do it. And I can honestly say like that was a career changing moment for me. And part of the reason that I'm here right now is whether we realize it or not, we have moments of blame or moments of like, come on, it's so easy, just do it. But we are not in that leader's position. So I was that client. I did push back on them. And of course, being the amazing coaches they were like, oh, of course, you know, how can we help? And from that point on, you know, things got better, frankly. But that was a very defining moment for me as a coach, actually. Come on, clicker. So, quick rundown of where I come from. I don't have to talk about Agile coaching as much, which is nice. But the role of Agile coaching has been central to my career for going on 10 years now. Prior to that, I was a Scrum Master. Agile has been central to my family for quite a long time. But again, always from a almost an outside perspective. You know, as Scrum Masters and coaches, we almost intentionally tend to be on the outside. What this role changed for me was it kind of made me be both. So I was the co-CEO of Scrum Alliance and the chief Scrum Master. So my job was really about, you know, how we worked as an organization. How could we be more agile? How did, like Ben referred to, how do we connect with our customers, which were all of our members? And how do we do so in a way that was really in alignment with our values? But I also had jobs like managing a budget and attending board meetings and working with the board. And so there are these things that were not necessarily contradictory, but I had to hold both of them, you know, at the same time. So what I'm going to share with you today is probably not going to surprise you. You were probably taught these things in class or in coaching programs, but what might be different is hearing it firsthand from someone who's been on both sides, if you will. And of course, I'd like to think we're all on the same team, but when you're in a conversation with a leader, there's you and then there's the leader, and you both are having different experiences. So if you're a coach or you have engaged with one, it's likely because there's something that needs to change. So when you are looking at that, you know, very tough client that you had or have right now, I want you to write down what needs or needed to change in 5 words or less, which is a lot harder than it sounds. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that. All right. If you are a coach or have engaged with one, it's likely because you recognize that catalyzing change requires support. So if you're a coach, you've been in this situation before. You've had challenging clients before, you've worked in organizations before, and you know you can't do that by yourself. So on another post-it note, write down who is required to support that change. And I will say this could be the person you already wrote down, but it could be additional people as well. So you've got the tough client, the change that needs to happen, and now who do you need to support that change? Okay, so we're going to go into our first quick set of breakouts. There's going to be 3 breakouts, just to give you an overall sense. There's going to be 3 breakouts, and in each breakout, you're going to be with the same 2 or 3 other people. So for this particular breakout, I just sort of want you to lay the scene for them. Kind of share as much about what you wrote down as you feel comfortable. Just kind of help them understand the scenario, because we're going to have 2 other breakouts where we talk about things from the coach's perspective and from the leader's perspective. And so right now you're just kind of letting them know, you know, setting the stage. And again, you'll stay with that same group for the other 2 breakouts. All right, welcome back. I imagine as you were talking that you probably were able to relate to some or most of what your fellow group mates were saying. So I want to ask you a quick question. Of these phrases on the screen right now, how many of these have you either, not how many, sorry, how many of you have either heard or said at least one of these phrases?
Yes.
Heard or said, okay. how many of you have at least thought one of these phrases? And if you need to, you could replace the CEO. Maybe you weren't working directly with the CEO, but a significant leader in the organization. Cool. All right. So when you look at the people that were required to support change in the organization, I wonder how many of them have you silently thought, God, come on, you know, this is easy. Let's just do it. You don't have to answer that. Just think it to yourself. But the fact is that my slides have a mind of their own today. The fact is that we need each other for all of this. So for the next several slides, I'm going to invite you to step into the shoes of your client. And that might be the one that you wrote down, or maybe it'll make you think of a different, a different group or person that you've worked with. And so if it's a different person than your most challenging client, write down the name of your current or your most recent client, person or group that you have worked with. And again, we're writing these down because I want us to actually look at these names while we're talking through some of these things and think about them as human being people. So, dearest coach, as a leader, here are the 3 things I wish you knew. Sincerely, you can replace it with that person's name. First, every decision is laden with nuance and complexity. So, in the example that I gave you of, myself sitting in that room with those 3 coaches, it's really easy in the coach place to see a clear path, right? To say, oh, this is so obvious, or this is so easy. But what they weren't thinking about was how many people had said to me, I'm afraid, or if you do this, then this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. And for leaders in that role, that is all day, every day. And frankly, so much more than I really understood. So you're constantly thinking about the people aspect of things, but you're also constantly thinking about the financial aspect, the customer aspect, in some cases, the board of directors or the shareholder aspect. And so nothing is cut and dry when you are in these shoes. Nothing is just do this, because everything has more complexity than you can imagine. When I spoke with other leaders, one of the privileges I had was being involved in other CEO groups or leader groups and talking with other leaders. Time and time again, I heard people don't understand that it's not that simple. And so, when we're sitting with leaders and asking them powerful questions, which is really important, they probably have 6 answers before they actually tell you, whatever the answer is that they speak out loud. And one of the hardest things is there are a lot of things they cannot share. Sometimes it's legal, sometimes it's HR, but there are a lot of things also that even in the confidentiality of a coach-client relationship, a CEO or a leader may not be able to share everything. So one of the things they want you to know is that everything is complex. And so when you're looking at your note about the change that is needed, consider that there might be a lot of complexities at play that you don't or may never be aware of. Dear coach, my authority is not unlimited. And I have to be honest, this is another thing that you think, oh, they're the CEO, they're the final, the final answer on everything. They have all the authority, they could do whatever they wanted, they're just choosing not to. And frankly, there were times in this role that I felt the least able to make decisions or the least able to exercise my authority, not because I didn't, have it technically, but at any given time, you are weighing the feelings, the careers, the well-being, the expectations, the desires of every person in your organization, plus your board, plus your customers. I mean, the amount of implicit limits on the authority are immense. There may not be a lot of explicit limits. Those explicit limits might be budget. They might be, things that are, if it's a nonprofit, like things that are in the charter of the organization. But there are a lot of implicit limits on the authority. And a CEO cannot just say, okay, I do what I wish, and it doesn't matter what other people think. I suppose they could, but that wouldn't be a very good CEO. Dear coach, there's a fear factor, an immense responsibility to get it right. I'm going to say that at the beginning of my tenure in this role, I thought this was just me. I thought, oh, I have imposter syndrome. Oh, I'm just new in this role. I'm inexperienced, and that's why I have this fear factor. I can tell you about a time that we made a really big change in the organization that had to do with some people moving out of the organization, other people moving in. And I had to stand in front of the entire company and basically accept responsibility for that change. And just before I stepped out into the area where everyone was, I literally thought I was going to vomit. I mean, I was terrified. And, but I stepped out and I have some acting skills. And I was able to kind of hold my composure and do what I needed to do for the company. And I had someone come up to me afterwards and say, like, oh, that was so brave. And, I'm just so floored. And I was like, are you kidding me? I literally almost threw up in the bathroom right before I walked out here. And that was another, honestly, a defining moment for me as well. Because I realized it wasn't just imposter syndrome. As I moved on and actually told that story to other friends and CEOs, and they were like, oh yeah, me too. That one time that I went out and made that announcement, I was scared to death. And I was like, wow, I never would have known that. I never would have known that. And so I think it's useful for people to know that leaders are terrified too. They don't have it all figured out, and we don't talk enough about how human leaders are. And that's a whole nother talk, by the way, but it is one that I am really excited to kind of share and encourage people to tell their stories about their vulnerability. So when you're looking at this note about the change and the leader that you're working with, consider that there are competing values, priorities, and frankly, there's a loneliness of bearing that alone. Because like I said, there's a lot of things you can't necessarily share with everyone in your organization, even though you probably desperately want to, even though sometimes it's at the expense of yourself. You have to let people draw their own conclusions because, for good reasons, sometimes you can't tell the whole story. So I'm curious now, what would your client say that they wish you knew? When you think about complexity, when you think about fear, when you think about, the different competing priorities and the loneliness of sort of bearing that all alone, I want to ask you first to just write down 3 emotions that they might be experiencing in their current situation right now. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Okay. So we're going to go back into our great breakout rooms with our groups. And I just want you to share 2 things that surprised you when you were reflecting from the leader's perspective. This one's going to be a little bit shorter, just 6 minutes. for each of you to share just a little bit. But what are two things that you hadn't necessarily thought of, or maybe just not in a while? Maybe you had sort of allowed that to go back to the background, and you're realizing now that, you know, maybe something's going on with them you hadn't thought of. All right, welcome back. So there are two sides of this conversation. So for the next couple of slides, I'm going to share the coach view. So dearest leader, as a coach, here are the three things I wish you knew. I do actually give this talk both to coaches and leaders, which you can probably tell, but I just want you to know from the coach perspective that I do talk with leaders about having empathy for you as well. So, dear leader, because the coach said so will never lead to meaningful change. So I know I have been in situations as a coach many times where, you know, the leaders who hired me said, well, I brought you here for a reason and I'm paying you for a reason, so just tell them what to do. And, you know, having conversations with the leader about, I could do that, but the minute that I leave, the minute that you stop paying me, it will likely all fall apart if they're only doing it for me or they're only doing it for you. And so helping the leader understand the power of coaching itself, not just Agile coaching, but, you know, coaching and helping people to find their path can be really powerful. But PS, coaches, powerful questions are not always the answer. And I understand I'm being a little bit controversial by saying this, but the truth is we have experience and we can at least share with the people that we're working with what we have experienced when they're stuck. I've also heard many leaders say to me, stop asking me questions, stop coaching me. I'm stuck and frankly, I'm upset and I just need a light. Like I just need to hear that someone else has been through this, and it doesn't mean I'm going to do exactly what you say, but don't question me into just a complete tizzy, frankly. And so I think with this one, there's two sides of this as well. Dear leader, as a coach, I need your engagement to make meaningful change. And so just like if I leave and I've just told everyone what to do, that things might fall apart. Also, if I am coaching really, really well and doing my best work, but every time that I share something or help a team find their way on something and then you do the exact opposite, then there's no way meaningful change is going to happen, because people are looking at, you know, their role models and their examples in the organization, and they're looking at it for not only what should I do, but what am I going to be rewarded for? And so we have to have our leaders engaged. Now, this is not news to anyone on this call, but it might be news that we have to have the conversation and that we have to be vulnerable about it. And we have to be willing to say, look how valuable this could be if you understood how your engagement was helpful and how your disengagement is unhelpful. And that's a hard conversation to have. Like, I've been there. It's a lot easier to just say, well, I'm going to do the best I can regardless of the leader. But frankly, for the sake of the change, we have a responsibility to have the conversation if that's happening. Dear leader, it's strange being on the outside. What's interesting about this one is how many coaches I've talked to who are so intent on being objective and neutral, which I completely understand and is part of our job, that it means that they're not actually establishing meaningful relationships. And there is a very thin line to walk there. I totally understand that. But we are emotionally invested or we wouldn't be doing this work. And so helping the leader to understand that, you know, it's a little bit strange to be on the outside. And the funny thing is, they will probably understand because they too are on the outside. And so being able to talk about boundaries, like what are good boundaries for neutrality in our relationship or in my relationship with your teams, and how am I going to engage with you and engage with the teams in such a way that I'm still a human being, but I maintain my objectivity, I maintain my neutrality, and you're able to hear me because we have a relationship and I'm objective. So the self-reflection I'd ask from you right here is, could you share any of these things in your current coaching relationship if they apply to you? I'm not assuming everyone had the same experience as me. Maybe there are other things that you should or could share with your client that you haven't yet. And so I'm going to ask you to take a couple seconds, write down 3 things that you could share with your client that you haven't to this point. Our last breakout group, this one will be a little bit shorter because this is your coach perspective. This probably wasn't terribly surprising to you, but I do want to give you an opportunity to talk with your group members about 2 things that surprised you when you were reflecting from the coach perspective. It might be the things you wrote down, or maybe these things that I shared you don't actually experience, and that's okay, but it might have surprised you that someone else experienced them. And you might be able to connect to someone in your group who does. So with that, last breakout group, just 4 minutes, and I'll see you back here to wrap it up. So just to sort of take us home here, these last few slides will be kind of quick, but I just wanted to share, like, holding all of these things in my head and in my heart was difficult at first, because if you think about some of the things we discussed from the coach perspective, and then some of the things we discussed from the leader perspective, sometimes they can conflict a little bit. And that's probably why we're there, right? So, you know, thinking about it in terms of all this complexity that I have as a leader, but as a coach, prior to this, for years, I had been trained to think creatively and think out of the box. And that can feel kind of scary when you're thinking about complexity. Like, in the middle of complexity, even though it's probably the exact wrong thing, you kind of just want like the safest, most direct route, you know, to safety. And so those things felt sometimes like they were competing. The next one is, as a leader, you can be expected to have all of the answers. And, you know, obviously I knew I didn't, but there's this expectation. But the coach in me knew, like, I'm better off if I explore. And so there's this vulnerability of saying, like, in order to explore, I have to admit I don't have all the answers. And then this being on the inside versus being on the outside. As a leader, I am as inside as you can be. You know, I am committed and I am responsible and accountable and all of these things. Yet as a coach, I've been trained to think objectively and to kind of step outside myself and step outside the organization to think about things, you know, very objectively. And so at first, these things felt like they were in conflict. But as you can imagine, as I learned to balance these things, they made me better. And it made me better at both. I learned to reconcile when you have complexity. There's going to be a theme here. When you have complexity, it's scary, but think outside the box. When you need answers, it's scary, but seek exploration. Admit that you don't have the answers. And when you are deeply on the inside, it's scary, but step outside. Recognize that there are other ways to approach it, and you don't always have to take the safe route. So, a couple last notes here from our dear coach friend and our dear leader friend. And I put this in here intentionally. I want you to hear this because I think often you don't hear this enough. So for a moment, you can pretend like I am the client that you're working with. So dear coach, one last note. You may not hear this enough, but what you do is so essential to the success of me and my business. I appreciate your perspective and I appreciate your heart. And I'm not going to lie, this is what I needed to hear from time to time. So you might consider whether this is something you could share with your leader. But one last note, Dear leader, one last note. I see you. I see the endless meetings, the task list, the impossible decisions, the sleepless nights, and together we can navigate this. So just a couple takeaways. Don't play the blame game, even in your own head, because even if you think it's not affecting your decisions and the way that you communicate, it absolutely is. And frankly, I know that because I was that person. Continuously, intentionally invite empathy. Don't just say, oh, I'm empathetic, but intentionally invite the empathy into the partnership with your clients. Continually ask the questions, be vulnerable, be willing to have the conversation. And then holding both of those perspectives in your head and in your heart make you better equipped to coach. And so if you're not in the leader's position, that means you're going to have to ask them those questions. Ask them what they're not telling you. Ask them what they're afraid of. So the call to action here is to have that conversation with your client. What do they wish you knew? What can you share with them? Go deeper in that relationship because it will make it better for both of you and make you both more successful. So here's how you can connect with me. I have time for a couple of questions. I haven't been able to follow them in the chat while I was sharing my screen. So I'll leave this up for a minute, but I'm happy to take a couple questions.
Mine was simple. We had the point brought up in our breakout of distinguishing between empathy and compassion. And you spoke of empathy, but empathy can get you caught up. And, whereas compassion may be a more powerful place to come from. Just curious if that lands anything with respect to your last slide.
Well, I can tell you personally that my personal values are courage, empathy, and creativity. So I can only speak to myself. I hear what you're saying, but I haven't had it steer me wrong yet when I put myself in someone else's shoes. And I ask them the questions that help me to do that. Certainly it can catch you up, and that's why we're trained to recognize that, you're trained to recognize collusion. But I've never been steered wrong by at least understanding and putting myself in someone else's shoes. Someone earlier in the chat, I caught this one and I just couldn't stop when I saw it. Is someone asked about what about transparency? I'm gonna take this down so we can see you better. And it's a fair question. And I'm guessing this is when I was talking about you can't share everything. And I am a massive fan of transparency, and I invite you to ask anybody who worked at Scrum Alliance or any of the clients that I've worked with that I really am, but there are some things that you can't share as a leader. And most of the time it's because you're protecting not yourself, but someone else. So there are HR things that I'm not going to share for the safety of somebody else. But I really did make an effort to be as transparent as possible with finances, with why we made the decisions that we made. So please don't hear me saying like, hiding is good. But there are just some things that are important. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was asking the thing with transparency because often there are also some political games between other leaders and managers and so on, who of course kind of prevent transparency because they had their own agendas. What do you think about that?
It certainly happens. For the most part, that wasn't my experience, but Scrum Alliance is a small organization. I mean, there were 55 people. And we were a flat organization with very, very little hierarchy. And so, I definitely hear what you're saying in terms of, many companies that are bigger and have a lot more layers, a lot more agendas. So definitely.
So my question is, the CEO profile that you picked to share, tell me the answers sometimes and the complexity. Are there different personalities of CEOs in your view?
Of course, sorry. Of course there are. I mean, I was sharing my experience, frankly. And that's the only place that I can speak from. I can tell you that in getting to speak with other people in the same role as me during that time, they're a lot more like me than I ever would have guessed. And you may not know it right off the bat when you meet them. We are conditioned societally, especially in North America and in the States, to, you know, behave a certain way as a CEO. And I found myself caught up in that sometimes too. And I had to like continually like, be yourself, be authentic. You don't have to put up this wall. So yes, you are absolutely right. There are many different CEO profiles for sure, but I was surprised to learn how many more of them were like me than I thought.
Well, let's. We're going to wrap up there. We're really grateful for Melissa joining us today, but she actually has a meeting like straight after it. It's still the working day over in Colorado. Melissa, thank you very much. I want to thank you for sharing and for your generosity and candor with the kind of subjects that you've presented to us today, and the really thoughtful questions and the really good process you've taken us through. What's next for you generally?
Still getting my feet under me at Sauce Labs. It's a growing company, and it's pretty cool though. This is not a sales pitch, but we do automated testing. So it's been really fun to kind of figure out how to blend, you know, this need that I know a lot of my Agile friends and teams have with this new company. So yeah.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Really great
to super fun.
Cool. Thank you. The last thing for me to say then is thanks everyone for joining us. Our next proper ACE event will be on the 26th of May, where we are really pleased to have the return of Kareem Harbut. We'll have the details upon meetup very soon. The week before that, though, we do have our next ACE coaching circle. So those that are looking to practice professional coaching skills, there's details on the meetup site for that as well. That's all about practicing with real people on real subjects and getting feedback on your coaching style. So check all of that out. But thank you very much, everyone. I just want to wish you all the best for the rest of the week. Please stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you soon.